If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to Romans chapter 1. This is where we will be spending our time today. One characteristic that, at least it seems to me, could be observed in modern human living is the fact of a condition known in philosophy as the wanton. The wanton. This is the person, it's usually descriptive of an animal, wherein just pure instinct and response to those instincts and response to stimulus creates the behaviors without any real thought or deliberation being placed within that moment of the behavior showing forth. So there's no desire is the only method of hierarchy in the mind, if you could call it a mind, of this particular animal. It's the consciousness of the higher animal, a wanton. And it seems to me human beings share this, at least in some respects, and especially within the description that Paul is going to give to humanity regarding how we are now that we have fallen. Let's take a look at this text, and I will begin reading in verse 28 of chapter 1. Even as they, that is, the human beings, and I'll make the substitution here for we, because really this is how this text should be read. Even as we did not like to retain God in our knowledge, God gave us over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness. We were full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. We were whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, and disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, and unmerciful. We, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but approve of others who practice them. Pretty rough indictment. And this is really, if you wanted to sum it up, these things are the sum total of what a human being becomes when they fully reject God. It was interesting, if you go back to the Nuremberg trials with the Nazis, so many of them said, the worst thing is not what we did to the Jews, the Gypsies, and the Roma, and everybody else, the mentally deficient that we found and that we punished or tortured or killed. The worst thing is what we've done to ourselves. To push the governance of the Creator out is to become something else. In verse 28, things not fitting, it is though something very deep is being reflected here. Morality is tied to something much deeper than just the simple idea of right and wrong. Very much deeper. If we live our lives as though our lives have no purpose, then our lives will look just like what Paul has described. Now that's fascinating to me. That merely by removing a purpose for being a human being, that we will degenerate, and we will. The Westminster Catechism, humanity's purpose is to know God and enjoy Him forever. Now I know that's not scripture, but it is perfectly biblical, because without God, just put in an if proposition. If God exists, then He's the maker of everything. If He's the maker of everything, He is the maker of we who are sentient, who can know of Him, according to the text we just read. And if that is true, then without God in relationship to us properly, human flourishing will be stunted. That list looks like a pretty stunted human flourishing to me. It is literally saying that we don't just lose God's favor. We do lose that, but we lose our very humanity. And how is this manifested? Paul uses a very specific term, poneria. And badness is the way you might translate this particular term. But it's a specific kind of badness. It's different from just being kind of bad. I know this sounds kind of redundant, but it's something much deeper than just mere badness. It is mere badness simply inflicts harm in a kind of an innocent way. For instance, if let's say you and I are in a traffic situation and somebody wants to get into our lane and they really need to get in. They're not trying to hurt us, they're not trying to do something bad, they're just trying to get where they have to go, and they have to be in our lane to do it. And so they get in and it's too close, they don't hit us, but it creates a situation, a traffic situation. That's the kind of badness that's just mere badness. That we're just selfish and we do things and we hurt other people unintentionally. We're not trying to hurt them. This kind of badness that Paul refers to here, the porneia, is a different kind of badness. It is the kind of badness that desires to harm people as a goal. How do I know this? Well, in Matthew 13, Satan is referred to as ho poneros. Ho poneros, the evil one. This word is applied to wrongdoing in Greek as a deliberative process. A person is thinking about it. It's not one content to merely be bad because they're selfish. It's one who is bent upon destroying goodness. That's a pretty harsh indictment. Paul continues this list with the effects of our rejection of God as ruler and our removing ourselves from that source of human flourishing. The word covetousness is a compound word, and it simply means to have more. The Greeks described it as not just the having of more things, but the accursed love of having for its own sake. I'm going to say that for we who call ourselves North Americans, it burdens all of us to one degree or another. I mean, advertising works. Even if the advertising does nothing more than alert us to the fact that there's something new out there to be had. It is a kind of draw that we are, none of us, immune to. We may think we are. We may think we are. Our closets and our storage buildings and our bedrooms tell a different story. He then uses the word kakya, which is a viciousness. This viciousness is generally spoken of in the classics as a kind of a general condition which is destitute of goodness. Now, this is almost revered in our day. There are movies made, I'm not going to name them, wherein the characters have this kind of viciousness, and they're the hero. It's seen as a good thing, the bull in the china shop mentality. He then says envy. Not the kind of envy that might emulate and aspire, but an envy that resents the accomplishment of another. We look at the word, he talks about murder. We look at the word in terms of the deed itself, which is terrible. But God looks at the intention of the heart before the murder takes place. Strife, Paul speaks of, which is what? An inability to take pleasure in the successes of other people, so we contend with them for our spot. We got to have our place in the world. Deceit. This is really deep. It's one where a person does everything with a hidden motivation. It's like a mental contamination. Now the list goes on and uses some of the same words in some secondary ways. It's wild to me. If you read verses 29, the second half of 29 through 31, it looks to me like it describes the average sitcom character to me today. Now, the Romans, at the time in which Paul writes this, would have heard these in some very particular ways. For the Roman, honor meant glory. That was the highest Roman ideal, the glory of Rome and that sense of honor. That's why the soldier who failed in his mission was obligated to kill himself or be executed. The honor was so important to that soldier, to anybody, that it was worthy of death if you didn't maintain it. The Greeks didn't look at things this way. For instance, for the Roman, bribery was seen as punishable by death. If you were a Roman centurion and you were bribed, it was death. You were unfit to live. But the Greeks, they thought nothing of it. It was just part of life. Part of life. Some translators translate astorgos, disobedient to parents, but that's really, that again, it's almost like words can't quite capture what is being written of here. It is actually without natural affection toward the family. Not even having it is what it means, astorgos. Children weren't seen as a blessing in this culture. Not for the Romans and the Greeks. Now, for the Jews, they were, as long as they were male. But in Rome, every night, 30 to 40 children could be heard crying in the environs because they had been put out, babies I'm talking about, and left to be exposed to the elements and the wild animals because they just weren't wanted. Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, now think about this. Here's a person who is writing things that kind of establish the ethic within his culture, very much like some of the writers we have today in our culture. And Seneca said this. He lived in Spain, Stoic philosopher, contemporary of Paul. He said, "We kill a mad dog. We slaughter a fierce ox. We plunge a knife into sickly cattle lest they taint the whole herd. Children born weakly or deformed, we drown." Now, both to the mercy to both the Romans and the Greeks was seen as a weakness. So when Paul writes this, he's hitting them right where they live. He is describing, in many respects, the actual ethos of the Greek and Roman culture, in many respects. And he's also explaining something of how God's wrath operates within this exposure to God's wrath. And in other words, if we live this way, we're exposing ourselves to something of God that we really aren't going to like. It's not this kind of idea of God being the police officer who just pursues the evildoers and punishes them. It is that he withdraws himself. We don't see the consequence here because we really don't have anything, a mental matrix to plug it into. But he withdraws himself and allows us to live without him. You want it that way? Is that how you really want things to be? God steps aside and says, go ahead. As C.S. Lewis said so well, some people come to God and they say, your will be done, God. And then some people, God says to them, no, your will be done. This is the description that we're seeing here in Paul of what human society looks like when God is removed. And funny, isn't it? Isn't it funny? Interesting? Sickening? However you want to, whatever adjective you want to place to it, that it seems to be what we want. Valeria Messalina, who was the wife of Claudius, the emperor, AD 41 through 54, she would go into the brothels. This is a woman who was somebody's wife. Because she was wealthy, because of who she was, she would go into, she could do this. She would go into the brothels and she would serve as a prostitute purely from lust. Purely from lust. One of the characteristics of human existence today, we see it all over. I see it in myself, I see it in people I care about, I see it in the wider world, partially because our culture operates on consumerism, that's just how we live. I mean, this economy couldn't function, could it, really well if it weren't for that consumerism. Got to have the new thing, got to have the better thing, got to have the replacement thing. Somebody goes out and buys an iPhone 4. Well, an iPhone 4 is junk now. Toss it in the ash can and go get the iPhone 5, and then the iPhone 6 comes out, and of course 4 and 5 now are nothing to be held on to. They're paperweights. I mean, there are people, I know some who will literally, as soon as the new phone comes out, they ditch their old one and run straight out, a couple of $100 plunked down, or whatever it costs to have the new one. never satisfied. Ingratitude is part of that equation. Why so much of this great list of vices in Paul's letter? Why does he have this great list? If we reject God, we reject the maker and the giver of all things, not just the things material. And when something inexplicable happens, or the mundane aspects just of the normal provisions of life are seen, we see them. You ever hear somebody, I was watching TV, I don't even remember when, it was a week or two ago, and somebody on the television, this was just a weather person, happened to say, it's a good thing that if we just go out and count our blessings, that today a tornado didn't take away our home, or I think it had to do something with some weather events that were happening in the country, some flooding. I believe it was the flooding in West Virginia they were speaking about. And they said, of course, in the Midwest, every year the Mississippi River floods. And that's just part of the natural cycle. The fact that we've built stuff in the floodplain doesn't matter to the Mississippi River, can't tame it. We've tried. And they were speaking about some flooding in the Midwest, and they said, don't we need to just count our blessings? And I thought, isn't that something? Here we are. That's a good admonition. But whom do we thank? Who do we thank? Think about it. We go get on an airplane, and we're in flight. This happened several decades ago, but it happened. There was a flight coming into Fort Lauderdale. I don't remember where they were coming from, and they were about an hour out, and all of a sudden all of the engines stopped. Now, when you're making this flight pattern, you have two choices. You either find an airport where you can land, or you go into the ocean, because that's the only other safe place of any reasonable safety to go. Well, this plane's engines cut out one at the time. The officers on the plane could not get the engines restarted. They came to the place where they said, okay, they announced to the passengers, put your tray tables up, get your seats in the upright position. It's likely that we're going to, in the next few minutes, have to ditch the plane in the water. We want to brace everybody for the impact. We want all the stewardesses and stewards to strap themselves into their seats. But then as they're flying along and they're working on all of this and getting the glide angles and everything adjusted, an engine starts. And then another. And then a third. So they now have 3 engines operating, and they're able to take the plane and land it safely in Fort Lauderdale, and they didn't have to ditch. Who do we thank then? The pilot and the co-pilot didn't do it. The engines just spontaneously started themselves. Who do we thank? Who do we thank when we wake up in the morning and our eyesight is good and our bodies function and we have feeling in our hands and feet and we can stand up? Who do we thank then? Count our many blessings, that's a good thing, but who are we thanking? See, thankfulness is so linked in this. Ingratitude and the ways in which humanity turns out when God removes His Spirit from us because of how we are. Ingratitude is so much a feature of that. Now, how is this thankfulness to God to be lived out? Well, a couple by the name of Norm and Hope Davis a few years back were selected for The Great Race, that TV show where people are racing from one point to another point, and it's a kind of one of those reality shows, I guess. I've never watched it, but I'm assuming it's a kind of a cutthroat situation, very much like the how is it, this tribal show that they've got on TV now? I can't even think of the name of it. I've never watched that either. Anyway, Norm and Hope were eliminated on their second show. Why is that? Why didn't they last any longer? Well, they said the producers, this is in an interview later, focused on those who bent the rules. They focused the attention of the cameras and the narrative on those who gained an unjust advantage, who were bickering, who sullied the other racers to their own advantage. And they said, we knew at home our two young sons were watching us. You see, these two people were followers of Jesus. They were made fun of on the show. And they were, of course, they paid for their integrity by being ridiculed and, of course, being kicked off the show. But you see, they have a hope that bypasses this world, for which they are thankful. And that produced in them a desire to live in a certain way because of their young sons at home. What a contrast between the way it is in which a person lives who is walking with the Spirit of God and is as close to human flourishment as they can get in that walk, and the comparison with that and a person who is as Paul describes here, which is the way that most of the world looks. There is a bit of us in Paul's description, all of us. But we also are those who have a hope that bypasses this world, and we are thankful. Oh, let God cultivate in us that sense of thankfulness to Him, and lives will be changed. I don't know where everybody is today, but if there's anything I've said about which you have a question, you want to speak with me,